I don't think a $4 million a year practice is possible if doctors are trying to do all their own hygiene. I think the only way we get to that place is by elevating the services we're offering in hygiene and giving hygienists an opportunity to really develop themselves as leaders within the organization.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Raving Patients podcast. As you know, I'm your host, Dr. Len Tao. And I also want to start off by saying I would love you to check out and thank our sponsors. Our sponsors are Dental Intelligence, Cloud Dentistry, and the Doc site. So you'll hear their commercials throughout the episode. So please take a couple moments and check them out, learn more about those options, because without them, I wouldn't be able to put this podcast on as often as I'm doing it and providing content to you. So thanks to the sponsors for allowing me to do this. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about high performance hygiene. As you know, the hygiene department in offices is the profit center. It's where you make a lot of money. And today we're going to be talking about someone who is extremely well known in the dental industry. She teaches high performance hygiene. So I want to welcome to the Raving Patients podcast, Wendy Briggs. Wendy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Tao. It's an honor to be here.
So first off, and I should have told you this ahead of time, call me Len. I like Len better. I don't like Dr. Tao. As you know, at this point when this episode is releasing, I will no longer be clinically relevant. I announced my retirement from dentistry in December. So when we actually play this episode, I will not be doing dentistry anymore. But I appreciate you calling me Dr. Tao, but call me Len. Okay.
Sounds good.
So Wendy, for those that don't know who you are and don't know what you do, can you go over who you are, what you do, how you help dentists, and then we'll get into the content part of the podcast.
So my story really begins in high school when I got a job with a friend of the family working in their dental office. And of course, like many people, it started out just being a little bit of the gopher, right? Helping with filing, helping with pulling charts, helping with sterilization. Eventually, I learned and became a dental assistant for him. And interestingly enough, at one point he said, "You're going to college. Why don't you go be a hygienist?" And he didn't even have a hygienist. So I had no context about what that was, but that ended up being my path. I went ahead and took care of undergrad and then went to dental hygiene school. And after hygiene school, I landed in a practice where it was a very young dentist. He had bought the practice from his dad. And here we were, two fresh newbies trying to figure things out, right? And as you can imagine, it wasn't an easy road. Didn't have the first clue about business at that time. And both of us had to really learn together. And what I realized at that time was a couple of things. I knew that I wanted to serve my patients at the highest level. And I also knew that in our profession at that moment, there were a lot of people telling me what I should be doing as a hygienist, but I needed more on the how, right? How to overcome the struggles that most providers have day to day, even now. Some of the struggles remain the same and some have morphed and have grown as our profession has evolved. And so that's really my path. As I started to study and learn how to become better myself, I was then challenged to share as we became better and we became more effective. And I was a high performance hygienist even back then in the 90s. My personal production average was about $2,000 a day even then. And I can tell you that for me, it was never about the production. That's really the only way we have of measuring care provided to patients. So production wasn't the goal for me. Instead, I learned that production was the result that came when I served my patients at a higher level than what an average hygienist might do, right? So that's really how I came to be where I am today. And today I own 2 consulting companies, and we help practices all around the world now. And our mission really is to support dental professionals in improving the dental health of the world. And so I've been absolutely blessed and honored to meet so many amazing professionals along this ride. And I can tell you, I learned as much from them as they probably learned from us. But today what we do is we really help dentists know how to maximize the potential opportunity in their hygiene department. And as you mentioned, hygiene departments can be incredibly profitable. But for many practices, especially right here, right now, with where we are with the labor market and inflation and insurance reimbursement rates declining, hygiene can also be a very difficult side of the practice if they're not doing things a certain way. So that's what we strive to do, is just help dentists realize a higher level of potential out of their hygiene department. And we help hygienists learn how they can be more effective without compromising the things that are important to them.
Gotcha. And as I started the podcast, I said that the the hygiene center is a huge profit center in the practice, and hygiene departments that are run effectively can make a lot of money for the practice. So you can't ignore it. But as you said, it can also be a difficult thing to run. And especially now, one of the first things I wanted to talk about was, the after effects of what COVID did. And I'll use a perfectly real example of what happened in my own practice. During COVID, my hygienist, who had been with me for just shy of 10 years, said that she needed to stop working because she needed to be home and take care of her son, who is now virtual. And I said to her, I appreciate that. I understand. Would you mind waiting until I find another hygienist? And I put an ad in every possible place out there, and every possible place, on DM, Indeed, Craigslist, you name it, we did it. And I did not get not one person to respond. So there is this level or this problem when it comes to hygienists finding work or really hygienists resigning from their jobs and being able to replace them. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is this, what we call the great hygiene resignation. So can you shed some light on your feelings there?
Yeah, I think, Len, that your situation was very, very similar to many, many providers, right? And it's not that, so some hygienists decided, hey, it's not safe with what we knew at the time. Remember, this is a new disease. We didn't know much about it. And we knew that it was, delivered through aerosols, at least initially. So hygienists were ranked at a very high risk job. And so we didn't know what we didn't know at that time. So there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear, and a lot of hygienists said, I'm going to step back and wait till we learn more about this disease before I feel comfortable working. That was one part of it. The other part were people who really wanted to work and see patients, but they couldn't, right? Because like you mentioned, they had childcare issues, they were caring for family members, or they had kids that all of a sudden weren't going to school. And so they were unable to work. I read a statistic last week that states that we're still down about 18,000 hygienists. I think a lot of hygienists, from what I'm hearing, once they stayed home, they realized, hey, we can actually make it on a single parent income, or they found other avenues to make income, and they decided not to go back to dentistry. I think, what I'm hearing is there's still a struggle. You're not the only one that places ads and doesn't get respondents. There's a lot of people who express frustration about setting up interview after interview and having no-show after no-show. So I think, this is a very real struggle. And one of the things that we have been doing in this time, first of all, when the shutdown initially happened, the first thing Dr. John, my partner, and I did was we began to research. I was working 14 and 16-hour days, just researching everything I could get my hands on previous COVID diseases and pandemics and how we were able to successfully get through those. So we started talking about how to go back to work safely. We even interviewed Dr. Gordon Christensen, and we had a whole way to help hygienists feel more comfortable about going back to work. So that's the first thing we did. And the second thing we've done since then is try to help bridge the gap within the shortage. So we've helped practices learn how they can shift to an assisted hygiene model if they're not fully staffed, and how to do that well in such a way that the patient and the hygienist are both comfortable and happy with that. So there's a lot of different ways that people are getting through it. As we chatted about briefly, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I think there's a period of high demand for hygienists, and it hasn't been that way for a while for us. And so it's a new frontier for many practices in many areas of the country. I know one of our doctors said that they had done their own hygiene for more than 9 months. And, that has a dramatic impact on the productive capacity of our doctors. So it's been a struggle. I do see some light at the end of the tunnel. It seems like the pressure is easing a little bit, but it's been difficult for many, many practices.
Yeah, it's crazy. Just what I see what some temp hygienists are making. Someone messaged me that they were asked to pay a temp hygienist $80 an hour. And obviously, it's tough to run a business when reimbursements are a lower than ideal, unless you're a fee-for-service practice. If you're an insurance practice, it's very difficult to do. So, let's shift gears a little bit and, let's talk about a positive thing. And I mentioned it, you mentioned it, that hygiene is a great big profit center in the practice. You can make a lot of money if you run it properly. So what is the best way, or what are some tips or tricks that you have for driving hygiene profitability?
so many people out there, for the last several decades, we've been taught that hygiene should be a loss leader, right? And that's really the insurance company's selling point is, hey, we're going to get you the patients. They're going to come through the door. And then once they're there, you can, take care of any restorative needs that they may have. And that's where your real profitability comes in. So in my mind, some experts out there even today are saying, hey, to grow your practice, to have hygiene be a profit center, the only strategy you can employ successfully is to reduce the appointment times down. Dentistry is a business of flow. And so they're thinking that the more patients we see, the more profit there will be. I can see why that sounds like it would work. However, in our experience, it really doesn't work well. In our approach, what we love to see happen is we love to see hygienists really embrace and maximize 3 roles of what we call a world-class hygienist. I'm going to come back to that in a second. In my mind as a provider, early on, I mentioned that for me, production wasn't necessarily the goal. So what happens in a practice that chooses to shorten the appointments down to have more flow through is that we actually see the standard of care and consistency of care really suffer. And over time, long-term, we see patients opting out of practices like that. So over time, it actually hurts practices. That's what we've seen from the data. So what we prefer to do is optimize the production per visit. And we do that without shortening the appointment time down. In fact, I would argue that if you put a Hygiene Diamonds trained hygienist that has a 60-minute appointment time up against a 45-minute appointment hygienist who sees more patients every day, the ones who maximize their 3 roles will outproduce and outperform the shorter appointment time every day, all day long, right? So maximizing 3 roles of a world-class hygienist is how we do it. And we teach hygienists what to do and how to consistently maximize their roles as a preventive therapist, as a periodontal therapist, and as a patient treatment advocate. So having systematic processes in place, a lot of companies, a lot of businesses talk about the importance of systems. Well, we believe this is absolutely true. And in my experience, a lot of hygienists really want to be productive. They want to serve patients at a higher level, but they don't necessarily have clarity on how to do that. What do they need to do differently day in and day out? How do they overcome the objections from patients? How do they overcome the objections from doctors? And frankly, to be honest, why should they if they're not compensated appropriately? So we've got to figure that out, right? In my opinion, that's a tactical error that dentistry has made. We've taken producers and providers, and when we compensate them at an hourly wage, we end up with an hourly mindset, an hourly focused employee. And that's really not what we want at all if we're focused on providing the best care possible for patients.
You almost have to give power back to the hygienist in some sense and give them the ability to do different things in the practice. You can't be so narrow-minded that they're only tooth cleaners, as we like to call them. There's a lot more to what a hygienist can do, and you have to embrace that. You have to give them the ability to become someone who is a high-level producer in the practice. So can you talk about how, maybe some ways to create or develop a high-achieving hygienist? Because, look, I don't want to say the wrong thing here and piss off my listeners, but, there are a lot of hygienists out there who are prima donnas. Not all of them, but there are a lot of them, and you hear stories about them, and they have a lot of expectations. They have a lot of things that they think they need or must have to do their work. But I think a lot of it has to do with the doctor or the owner of the practice giving them more of an ability to do things they want to do. So can you talk about some of that? How do you create this high achieving hygienist?
Well, again, to be fair, it's a little bit of a difficult place to be, right? Because I've seen the complete spectrum, as many dentists and doctors have. Hygienists that are hungry, that really want to do the best thing for their patients, and then a hygienist that I think end up in a little bit of a defensive mechanism where they feel like they have to fight to get things that are necessary to do the job well, right? The prima donna mindset, almost always, in my experience, that comes from a place where they're having to daily go to battle for their patients or for instruments or for, help with the team. Now, when we talk about, okay, how do we shift the mindset? Simon Sinek wrote a great book called Start With Why. And so one of the things that we try to do is get the entire team together and have clarity on why do we get out of bed in the morning? Why do we show up for work every day? What's important to you? in this job. And if you're just here for the paycheck, there's most likely, depending on the practice, a core values mismatch. So we try to help remind providers why we do what we do and why patients deserve the very best we can give them. And usually we can agree. I just say, can we all just take a minute and agree that patients deserve the best we can give them? And everybody says yes, literally always says yes to that. I said, okay, then let's get clarity on how we do that, right? How do we provide the best possible care? And so what we do is we often approach the entire trainings, all the trainings that we do from the scientific standpoint. What does the science say? Why do patients of today need preventive services at a higher level? Why do patients of today often say no to these services? How can we help them see the value? How do we build value? We teach a process by which hygienists can do a risk assessment. We provide them with an easy tool to be able to do this in a timely manner. And I think probably the biggest way that we empower the hygienists is we show them what's possible and we compensate them appropriately. We always say we loathe selfishness and we love teamishness. That's a quote I borrowed from HubSpot. And it's very, very true in dentistry. So we try to, get everybody centered back on what's the real purpose? Why do we do what we do? What are our values? What's important to us? What's important to the patient? Can we come to a place where we're all working together to provide the best possible care? And again, as I mentioned before, compensation is huge. The demands of some providers in this market have seemed somewhat ridiculous. But also, what are they trying to do? They're trying to provide a bigger future for their family. So what we try to do is provide a compensation structure that's a win-win-win. Win for the patient first and foremost. Always we should be making decisions about what's best for the patients first, then what's best for the provider, and what's best for the practice. And sometimes we end up in a situation where things are top heavy, right? Where the patient benefits, but the provider benefits far more than the practice. But what we have to do is we've got to gain alignment on that. And it doesn't make any sense to have a hygiene department that's not profitable, that's not sustainable long-term. Something's got to give in that scenario. And so often that's usually when we see services decline, appointment times get shortened. And if I could, teach your listeners one thing, it's that in our experience, that's the wrong strategy. There's more than one way to have a successful dental practice, certainly, but our focus is on the production per visit. And if we can elevate the care we provide and help patients see the value in stronger preventive therapies, restorative therapies, periodontal therapies, then in my experience, everyone wins. Patients are receiving a higher level of care. The provider is compensated appropriately when there's a good effort, when they're really working hard to provide a high level of care to patients. There's a return on that effort to the provider. So in our experience, that's the way to get past the prima donna mentality and right the ship, if you will, so that we can all be profitable.
It's interesting because I know there's some other people out there who are pushing a no hygienist model, which, for someone who practiced for 22 years and owned my own practice for 15 years, that would never even come up in a conversation in my mind. But there are a lot of people online pushing that. And I just don't understand that mentality. I would have to learn it to understand it. But from knowing what I know about running a business, I want the team members to be doing that work, not myself to do that work. So, one of the other things that I wanted to discuss with you, and I think it plays a big role in how practices do things, is I was a fee-for-service practice. We didn't participate with any insurance plans. And I think that's, it's not an oddity. There are plenty of people out of network and there's plenty of people who are fee-for-service. But, especially if you're an in-network practitioner and the reimbursement rates are shrinking and I see complained in all the groups. So you have a shrinking reimbursement. How do you overcome this shrinking reimbursement and still run a profitable business?
That's a great question. And I can tell you that the insurance companies win when we have a Prophy Palace, right? If all we're doing is exam, bite wings, Prophy, exam, bite wings, Prophy, exam, Prophy, periodontal maintenance, exam, bite wings, Prophy. If that's all we're doing, they're winning. And hygiene is not productive. Hygiene is not profitable. So the key is to expand our service menu, right? To focus on same-day dentistry, to focus on preventive services that patients desperately need, to get up to speed on all the science, to help to really work on our skills as a provider, to overcome objections, patients don't truly understand their insurance coverage. And I can say, we love working with fee-for-service practices, but I would say by far and above, the majority of practices that we work with are participating in a lot of insurance plans. The key is how you manage that, right? So there are write-offs, but again, if the patients are opting for a higher level of care, if they're paying out of pocket for fluoride varnish or other preventive services, the practice is way ahead at the end of the day. So the key really is to maximize the opportunities as they exist, having the team understand the impact of same-day dentistry, and the financial side of it is also really critical. And as I said, having systems for consistency so that we're providing a consistent, high standard of care across the board, and it doesn't vary from room to room. So many practices have one hygienist that does things a certain way and then another hygienist that does things their way, right? And what we find is overwhelmingly the practice will grow if we have a consistent standard of care and we are able to systemize certain things about how we deliver care to patients. As the hygienist-free model, you referenced that earlier. Some of these people say, well, we had $1 million a year and I didn't have to pay a hygienist. Well, in that structure, why would you want to limit yourself to $1 million practice? Under a hygiene model, we end up with practices that are in the multiple millions of dollars in revenue every year. And really the sky's the limit. So if the doctor has a vision where they want to go and build an enterprise in multiple locations, that's what you have to do. You have to have systemization and high value, high impact hygiene happening so that the doctors can do, you mentioned doctor's productive capacity, we want the doctor doing services only the doctor is licensed to do, and everything else could and should be delegated to the team. And I think there's also a little bit of a flawed thinking in that if you have a lot of hygienists or if you see a lot of insurance patients, the quality goes down. And I can tell you absolutely not. With what we teach, the quality of care goes up. It goes up dramatically. And we value that, right? Our patients are important to us. I love my patients. I absolutely did. And there was nothing I would do, nothing that we teach that would reduce the level of care that patients receive. So, everybody has their own idea. Like I said, there's more than one way to run a successful practice. But in our model, hygienists can and should be driving a higher level of care, not just on the preventive side or the hygiene side, but for the whole practice. So we often say as hygiene goes, so does the strength of the rest of the practice.
I think that makes perfect sense. Now, as we're exiting, 2022, we're talking about this, the great hygiene resignation. And we both said before, and you mentioned on here that I don't think it's going away anytime soon. So as we move, out of 2022 and into 2023, can you talk about some myths that exist in the hygiene industry or things that you think are not necessarily gonna come to fruition? And then I'm curious where you think the future direction is, if anything, of the hygienist per se.
Yeah, it's a great question. A couple of years ago, I was interviewed and published in a couple different magazines about, the future of hygiene. And it's really quite sad in some of the hygiene forums or the dental groups. It's also negative, right? A lot of hygienists are like, I hate this profession. It's really difficult it's hard on my body, which those are things that I do understand. And I feel for providers who haven't found a dental home that's been good to them, right? Sometimes you get out what you put in, and other times you can be a giver and be taken advantage of. So, when I look at the state of hygiene and where we are now, it sometimes makes me sad. But I believe, as I've always believed, that hygiene is an incredible career. It's an incredible profession. I think I do see the most successful practices growing hygiene, focusing on expanding hygiene services, expanding the value of hygiene leads to tremendous growth. We have some case studies now that are 12, 15 years down the road. And I can tell you one practice, particularly in Kansas, a small one doctor practice. When we first started working with him on hygiene, he was doing about $600,000 a year in gross production. And now he has 2 locations. He could grow beyond that if he wanted to, but that's where he's comfortable. And he'll do, close to $4 million this year. So I don't think a $4 million a year practice is possible if doctors are trying to do all their own hygiene. I think the only way we get to that place is by elevating the services we're offering in hygiene and giving hygienists an opportunity to really develop themselves as leaders within the organization. So that's another thing that I love that I'm seeing in hygiene is we go towards groups, larger groups, DSOs, if you will. And I know for some people leaves a bad taste in their mouth. But for us, I feel like, those who do it well and keep the values of patient care and the best optimal care for patients, what I see in that circle is an opportunity for hygienists to become executives. That doesn't happen with a solo practice. And so I think the future is bright. I think there's no limits to where hygienists can go. I'm personally experiencing that. I've lived that. I often say, certainly I'm very blessed to have the opportunities that I have, but myself and my team, if you would have told me 25 years ago that we'd be working with practices and groups internationally, I would have thought you were crazy. But I can tell you that I see a wide open opportunity for hygienists who really choose to develop themselves. And just like anything in society, I know I just read an article about people who are ghosting their jobs, right? They're choosing intentionally not to expend a lot of effort. And they're just going about the motions and just, coasting. They've made a choice that they're just not going to give a lot to their careers. And I think that's sad. You get out of it what you're willing to put in. And there's certainly plenty of wide open opportunities for hygienists who want to continue and develop. And there's plenty of opportunities for those who feel like that their time in the operatory is over and they'd like to expand a different future. There's so many opportunities out there. And I don't see that changing. I think it's a world of opportunity for all of dentistry, but certainly for the hygienist.
That was great. I love the content. As we move to the Q&A, the lightning round Q&A I like to do, but is there anything else that you wanted to bring up? Anything you think is important that we touch base on?
Yeah, I think probably more than anything, if you are not happy with where your hygiene is now, the good news is you can change that. Hygienists, if you're not happy with where you are now, with how you're performing or where the practice you're involved in, you can change that, right? So I think if you're not happy with how things are in dentistry, instead of complaining or griping or going on social media and being negative, figure out what are some things you can do to turn that around. We've had hygienists come and invest in our training themselves, which is awesome. The other thing I would say is a big focus right now is on hiring and developing your teams, not just hygienists, but assistants and front desk. And I think the most successful practices have really focused on, okay, how can we really onboard effectively? How can we provide the training so that we can develop that world-class team that we've always wanted to have? People always say, how do I hire a rockstar hygienist? And the answer really is you can't. You don't typically hire a rockstar hygienist, but you can develop them and you can give them the opportunities to really evolve as professionals and providers. And that's been really, really an awesome side benefit. An unexpected benefit is seeing so many providers transform their own capabilities and doing day in and day out incredible things for their patients.
That's great. That's great. So Wendy, as I told you before we started, I like a little section at the end. It's basically a lightning round Q&A. I pick up business topics or nothing inappropriate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a question. You can answer it and we go on to another question. Very easy. Okay. So, that's funny. What about the future was the first question, which we just answered. So, what do you want on your resume in 2 years that isn't there now?
I would say I've long had an idea for a reality TV show about dentistry, somewhat like Save My Bar or Restaurant 911 kind of thing. That would be really, really fun to do.
Okay, I think that's really good. What's the most common reason for people failing or giving up?
I think not having clarity on their vision. Vision is how we become what we want to become. And not having clarity on the vision of the practice is one reason that practices fail. Sometimes doctors aren't very good about sharing their vision and where they want to go. I think if you have clarity on where you're going, you're more likely to get there.
Do you have a hard time telling people no?
Oh, absolutely. I end up doing all kinds of projects that I really don't care to do. I think that's just part of the human experience, right? Is taking on or feeling like we have to do everything ourselves. And I see that a lot in dentistry too. I'm trying to do a better job of delegating to my very capable team. And when I do that, I know that they are able to grow as well.
Great. What do you do when things aren't working? Do you have any weird tricks for overcoming roadblocks?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love a Japanese word called a kaizen. And really, if I had to define that, it means to take something completely apart and put it back together in a better state. So when something's not working well, I like to do a Kaizen where we almost take it apart back to the ground level and figure out how we can rebuild it and do it better.
Perfect. Do you make a to-do list at all every day, weekly? When do you do it?
I try to do what's called a brain dump every so often. I learned this from my mentor, Dr. John Meese, where if I'm feeling overwhelmed or stressed, I'll just put on some music and do a brain dump. And it takes about 20, 30 minutes for me to write everything that's in my brain on a piece of paper and then organize that into most urgent projects and to-dos. And that seems to help me minimize stress.
That's awesome. So it's funny, you mentioned your mentor. The next question was, who do you look up to for advice or mentorship?
Oh gosh, there's so many people. But I mentioned Dr. John Meese. He's an incredible mind and an incredible teacher in dentistry. There's so many other incredible providers as well. Dr. Gordon Christensen, I mentioned him earlier. I've been able to do some work with him in recent years. On the hygiene side, there's so many people who blazed trails before me that are really incredible minds, as well as people like Catherine Eitel and people on the speaking side that really do a great job of leaving a message that imparts hope, and vision for the future. So there's so many. I mean, like Simon Sinek, I could go on and on.
Great. If you had the chance to start your career over again, what would you do differently?
I would probably try to do more shadowing. A lot of times you graduate from hygiene and you end up in your practice and it's very isolating within those four walls. And it took me a few years to figure out I actually could reach out to other providers and other practices. And I learned so much by visiting other practices. I wish I would have fast tracked that and started doing that sooner.
Perfect. This is a tough question. People struggle with this one. If you had a chance to open up a lemonade stand tomorrow, what would you call it?
Probably just world-class lemonade. I don't know. I have no idea. What's interesting is the house I grew up in, there was a 100-year-old lemon tree on the corner. So literally we did make lemonade every day, but we didn't necessarily sell it. We just drank it.
Okay. What is the one thing that doesn't add value to your life, but you still do it and don't want to give it up?
Yeah, I mentioned this earlier. I'm involved in a lot of Facebook groups for dentistry. And I can say it adds value in small ways, but it also detracts from the mission a lot because there is a lot of negativity. So I probably should spend less time on some of those social media groups. But I find it also somewhat fascinating because it tells me, where the mindset is of our profession. But again, probably less time in negative groups or surrounded with negative people.
Gotcha. Last question. What book do you want to go back and reread, or do you recommend everybody that's listening to this read?
Yeah, I just read an interesting article yesterday about a young man. Sadly, he died at age 14, but he was a fascinating kid. And he had already bought a ranch and was working on sustainable farming and everything when he died. And he mentioned a book. Oh gosh, I've got it right here because this is one I actually have on my list. And I'm like, I have got to go read this book. He called it The First 20 Hours. I read another book by the author called The Personal MBA that was fantastic. And I refer back to that often. But I want to read that first 20 hours again and again, in a way as a tribute to that amazing kid who tragically died so young.
All right. That's really good. So Wendy, you did a really good job answering those questions too. Thank you. How can people reach out to you? How can they find out more about what you and your company does to help dentists and teams and hygienists?
So obviously we have a website, www.theteamtraininginstitute.com. I also have an offer. A lot of times when I'm invited as a guest to speak on a podcast, I'll offer one of our books for free. So if you would love to have a copy of one of our books, we've written 4 or 5 that have become Amazon bestsellers in the dental space. And that's always fun to see. You can go to wendysfreebook.com. So WENDYS, wendysfreebook.com and register for that. I think we have you pay a little bit for shipping, but we cover the cost of the book and we'll send that out to you right away. And that can get you a lot of good insight. In that book, I do talk a lot about maximizing the 3 roles of hygiene, and it's loaded with practical, real world solutions to frustrations that dentists and hygienists have had and shared with us over the years. So that's a great way for them to get to know us. We also do have retreats every quarter. These are typically designed for our members, and practices grow incredibly quickly when they go to these retreats. And we're working on the practice, not in the practice. And occasionally we open up a few seats for guests at those retreats. And so obviously if that's something that is of interest to you, you can go on their website and ask about how do I become a guest at a retreat, and we'll see what the availability looks like. We have those every quarter. So
that's great. Again, you were an awesome guest. I want to thank you for being part of my podcast and giving your expertise to my audience. So thank you for that. If you are listening and watching and enjoyed the episode, please share it. Please let everybody know they should listen to this episode with Wendy. I really thought her insight on the hygiene, lifestyle, the hygiene, resignation, how to make your practice a lot more profitable using the hygiene department was terrific. Remember, check out our sponsors, the doc sites, Cloud Dentistry and Dental Intelligence. Again, I couldn't do without them. And as I always like to end these podcasts, remember, your reputation matters. Until the next episode, I will speak with you guys soon. And again, thanks, Wendy, for joining me.
Thanks, Len. Thanks for having me.